Mises versus Friedman, Austrian School versus Chicago School. Two intellectual titans, both fighting socialism, both defending markets, both winning Nobel recognition. Well, Hayek and Friedman did. Mises never got the prize, but that's another story. Here's what nobody tells you. They fundamentally disagreed about how to do economics, not just minor methodological quibbles, not just academic inside baseball. They disagreed about whether economics is even a science in the way physics is a science. And that disagreement, it determines everything. Think about the confusion you've experienced. You read Milton Friedman praising free markets. You read Mises praising free markets. You assume they're saying the same thing with different vocabularies. Then you notice Friedman advocating a monetary rule. The Fed should expand money supply at a fixed percentage annually. And you remember Austrian saying any central bank intervention distorts the economy. Wait, aren't these both free market positions? You hear Chicago economists using mountains of statistical data, running regressions, publishing empirical studies, proving minimum wage doesn't hurt employment or trade restrictions don't reduce growth. Then you hear Austrian saying you can't run controlled experiments in economics, that statistical correlations without theory are meaningless, that economic laws are derived logically, not empirically. Which approach is right? Does data matter or doesn't it? You watch Bitcoin debates where someone cites Hayek's denationalization of money and someone else cites Friedman's monetary theory, and you think, great, both Austrian and Chicago economists support cryptocurrency. Then you discover they'd reached that conclusion through completely opposite reasoning. One from rejecting all monetary central planning, the other from empirical analysis of velocity and money demand. Are they allies or rivals? Here's the truth Mises understood and fought his entire career to clarify. The Chicago School, despite genuinely opposing many government interventions, built their economics on a foundation that ultimately empowers the very interventionism they claim to oppose. And it all comes down to a question you probably never considered crucial. How do you know what you know about economics? You're not alone in this confusion. Most economics students graduate without understanding this split. Most libertarian-leaning Americans assume free market economists all agree on fundamentals. They don't. This episode will reveal the key differences between Austrian and Chicago School economics, not to score points, but because understanding this distinction transforms how you evaluate economic claims, policy proposals, and expert advice. You'll discover why Mises insisted methodology determines conclusions, why he considered Chicago's empiricism a fundamental error despite their shared opposition to socialism, and why this matters right now as inflation, Fed policy, and government intervention dominate American life. By the end, you'll never again confuse these schools. More importantly, you'll understand which approach actually delivers the logical certainty and practical wisdom you need to navigate economic chaos. If you want to discover more about Austrian economics and why methodology matters more than you think, subscribe to this channel where we explore Mises' revolutionary insights and how they apply to your real-world challenges. Let's start with what united these schools, because it's substantial and easily obscures their differences. Both Austrian and Chicago economists stood against the dominant intellectual tide of the 20th century. While Keynesian economics captured universities, while socialism seduced intellectuals, while government planning became conventional wisdom, both Austrians and Chicago School scholars defended markets, private property, and economic freedom. Imagine the academic landscape of the 1950s through 1970s. You're an economist who believes markets work better than central planning. You're surrounded by colleagues who think you're either naive or evil, probably both. Government expansion is progress. Regulation is protecting consumers. Monetary manipulation is stabilizing the economy. In that environment, Mises and Friedman were allies. Both published devastating critiques of socialism. Both explained how price controls create shortages. Both demonstrated how minimum wage laws hurt the very workers they claim to help. Both showed how tariffs reduce prosperity. Both opposed the growth of the welfare state. You know what fascinates me most about this? They could sit in the same room, agree that Keynesian demand management was nonsense, agree that the Federal Reserve caused the Great Depression, agree that free trade benefits everyone, and still fundamentally disagree about the nature of economic science itself. Notice how this works in reality. During the stagflation crisis of the 1970s, when Keynesian economics spectacularly failed, simultaneously high unemployment and high inflation, which Keynesian theory said was impossible, both Austrian and Chicago economists said, "We told you so." Friedman's monetarism explained it. The Fed expanded money supply too rapidly. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Austrian business cycle theory explained it. The Fed manipulated interest rates below market levels, creating unsustainable boom, inevitable bust, and price inflation from monetary expansion. Same conclusion. Fed caused a crisis. Different reasoning, one empirical, one logical. But here's where it gets interesting. Most Americans celebrating free market economics never asked if both approaches oppose the same policies but arrive there through different methods. Do those methodological differences actually matter? Mises with thunder, yes. Methodology is everything. Let me show you something amazing. In 1940, Mises published an essay titled The Treatment of Irrationality in the Social Sciences, where he directly criticized the Chicago School's approach. Though he didn't call it that yet. He wrote that economics cannot be built on empiricism because human action isn't mechanistic. You can't discover economic laws by observing data and running statistical tests any more than you can discover logical laws by counting how often people reason correctly. Friedman, meanwhile, published a methodology of positive economics in 1953, arguing the exact opposite. The validity of economic theory depends entirely on its predictive power, not its logical structure or realistic assumptions. If a theory predicts accurately, it's scientifically valid, period. Two brilliant economists, both defending markets, fundamentally oppose on the basic question, what makes an economic proposition true? Wait till you see what this disagreement produces when applied to actual policy questions. But first, understand this. Their alliance against socialism and Keynesianism was real and valuable. When Hayek debated socialists at the London School of Economics, when Friedman dismantled price control arguments on television, when both schools explained why central planning cannot work, they were fighting the same battle. The question is, were they fighting with the same weapons or just pointing them at the same enemy? That distinction determines everything about which free market economics can actually deliver freedom. Here comes a really interesting part. The Austrian School, especially as systematized by Mises, builds economics on praxeology, the logical study of human action. Chicago School builds economics on positivism, the empirical study of observable behavior and statistical patterns. You're probably thinking, okay, that's academic. Does it actually matter? It matters more than almost anything else in economics. Let me explain how Mises approached economic knowledge. He started with one undeniable axiom. Humans act purposefully. You're reading this because you chose to, pursuing some goal, knowledge, curiosity, whatever. That's not a hypothesis. That's not something you test statistically. It's a necessary truth you cannot coherently deny because the act of denying would itself be purposeful action. From this single axiom, Mises logically derived the entire structure of economics: subjective value, marginal utility, opportunity cost, time preference, comparative advantage, monetary theory, business cycle theory, all through pure logical deduction, the way geometry derives theorems from axioms. Why this method? Because Mises argued human action involves meaning, purpose, and choice. You can't study it the way you study chemical reactions or planetary motion. When atoms combine, they don't choose based on their subjective valuations. When planets orbit, they don't prefer elliptical paths. But when you buy coffee instead of tea, you're making a choice reflecting your subjective preferences, knowledge, and goals. Statistical analysis can tell you that X% of people chose coffee over tea. It cannot tell you why, in the sense of understanding the logical structure of choice itself. It cannot reveal universal economic laws because it's studying particular historical instances, not the logic of action as such. The Chicago School saw this completely differently. Friedman argued economics should be positive science, just like physics. Observe phenomena, form hypotheses, test predictions against data, refine theories based on statistical validation. The truth of economic theory depends on whether it accurately predicts outcomes, not whether the assumptions are realistic or its logic is purely deductive. Notice how this works in reality. Chicago economists study minimum wage effects by collecting data from different cities and states, running regression analyses, controlling for variables, and determining statistically whether employment decreased where minimum wage increased. Austrian economists would say, you don't need statistical studies. Logic demonstrates that if you legally prohibit employment below a certain amount, you necessarily prohibit all employment worth less than that amount to employers. That's not an empirical hypothesis requiring testing. That's a logical necessity derived from understanding what voluntary exchange means. But the Chicago economist responds, maybe employers have monopsony of power, maybe general equilibrium effects offset the direct impact, maybe workers become more productive when paid more. Your pure logic misses real-world complexities that data reveals. No, Mises would reply. Your statistical correlations miss causal relationships that only theory illuminates. You're drowning in data without understanding. You know what's crucial here? This isn't just academic methodology debate. It determines what counts as evidence, what constitutes proof, and what policies you'll support. Imagine this scene for a moment. Congressional hearing on raising the minimum wage. Chicago economist testifies, our empirical study of the last increase showed no statistically significant employment effect in fast food restaurants. Austrian economist testifies, economic logic proves minimum wage creates unemployment. If your study didn't find it, your methodology failed to detect it, not the law failed to apply. Who's right? Mises would say, the empirical study measured one particular historical situation with countless variables. Maybe employers absorbed costs through price increases. Maybe they reduced other benefits. Maybe they delayed hiring they would have done. Maybe macroeconomic growth masked the effect. The statistical study cannot isolate causation. Only theory explains cause and effect. Chicago would say, Mises' pure logic might be elegant, but if reality doesn't match the prediction, the theory needs revision. Science progresses through empirical testing, not armchair deduction. Here's what you need to understand. This methodological split determines whether economics can deliver certainty. Mises believed it could logical certainty, derived from undeniable axioms. Chicago believed economics delivers probabilistic predictions, continually refined by data. And that difference? It transforms everything about policy, money, and intervention. Let's see where this methodological divide produces dramatically different policy conclusions. Monetary theory. Both schools oppose runaway inflation. Both criticize Federal Reserve policy. Both explain how money creation causes problems. But their solutions diverge fundamentally because of their methodological approaches. Milton Friedman's monetarism argued, the Fed should expand the money supply at a fixed rate, matching long-term economic growth, maybe 3 to 4% annually. This monetary rule would eliminate Fed discretion good, provide predictable monetary expansion necessary for economic stability, and prevent both inflation and deflation. Friedman reached this through empirical analysis. He studied historical data, established statistical correlation between money supply and price levels, formulated the equation of exchange, and concluded that stable, predictable monetary growth would optimize economic performance. Mises would have considered this dangerously wrong. Wait till you see why. From the Austrian perspective built on praxeology, any monetary expansion beyond what individuals voluntarily produce through market processes, like gold mining under a gold standard, necessarily distorts economic calculation. It doesn't matter if it's predictable or fixed. The distortion is an inevitable logical consequence of injecting new money into the economy at particular points. Here's how Mises would analyze Friedman's monetary rule. When the Fed creates 3% more money annually, where does it enter the economy? Through banks making loans. Who gets it first? Borrowers closest to the monetary spigot. Big banks, government, large corporations. What does this do? It allows them to bid up prices before the new money spreads through the economy. By the time the new money reaches wage earners and savers, prices have already risen. This is a Cantillon effect. Monetary expansion benefits early recipients at the expense of late recipients. It redistributes wealth. It distorts relative prices. It makes economic calculation less accurate because entrepreneurs can't distinguish price changes from real supply and demand changes versus price changes from monetary manipulation. Notice the logical structure here. This is an empirical claim Mises is making. He's not saying, I studied data and found the Cantillon effect. He's saying, given what money is medium of exchange, given what calculation is rational comparison of alternative uses, given what new money injection does, enters at specific points, there's redistribution, and distortion follows logically, necessarily. You can't refute it with statistics because it's not a statistical claim. Chicago School would respond. But empirically, Friedman's rule would produce better outcomes than the discretionary policy we actually got. Judge theories by results, not abstract logic. Mises would counter. You're comparing bad to worse. That central bank monopoly exists at all is a fundamental error. You're asking whether the counterfeiter should inflate 3% or 7%, when the question is whether anyone should have legal monopoly on money creation. Here comes the really fascinating part. This methodological difference leads Chicago School economists to support central banking with good rules, while Austrian economists oppose central banking altogether. Friedman genuinely believed empirical analysis showed optimal monetary policy was possible if you had the right rule. His methodology, test predictions against data, led him to think you could scientifically determine the correct money supply growth rate. Mises believed economic logic proved no central authority can determine optimal money supply, because optimal means satisfying subjective preferences of millions of individuals making trillions of calculations. No statistical analysis can aggregate those preferences into a single correct number because preferences aren't quantities to be summed. They're ordinal rankings that can't be mathematically combined. See the difference? Chicago's empiricism makes them think scientific management of money is possible. Austrian praxeology makes them think it's logically impossible. And here's why this matters right now. When you hear Fed policy debates, should they raise rates, lower rates, expand balance sheet, contract money supply, Chicago-trained economists argue about the optimal empirically determined policy. Austrian-trained economists argue the entire framework is flawed. The Fed shouldn't exist because no institution can centrally plan optimal money supply any more than it can centrally plan optimal shoe production. If this methodological difference impacts conclusions this dramatically, hit like so more people discover why how you do economics determines what conclusions you reach. Same topic, monetary policy. Opposite conclusions, reform versus abolish. All because of methodology. Let me show you where Chicago School's methodology leads to accepting interventions Austrians categorically reject. Chicago economists genuinely oppose most government intervention. Friedman brilliantly demolished arguments for price controls, tariffs, occupational licensing, agricultural subsidies. His free-to-choose book and TV series converted millions to market economics. But notice what Chicago School methodology permits. If you can empirically demonstrate that a particular intervention produces net positive results, you can support it on scientific grounds. And that's exactly what happened. Friedman supported school vouchers, government funding education but allowing choice. He supported negative income tax, government redistribution, but more efficient than welfare. He supported antitrust intervention in certain cases where empirical analysis suggested monopoly power harmed consumers. He supported drug prohibition until empirical evidence convinced him otherwise, meaning his position was contingent on data, not principle. The Chicago School approach, Judge each intervention pragmatically. If empirical analysis shows benefits exceed costs, support it. If data shows harm, oppose it. You know what fascinates me? This sounds reasonable, scientific, empirical, but Mises would identify the fatal flaw. You've conceded that intervention can be justified given correct empirical evidence, which means you have no principled basis to oppose intervention. You've accepted that government can intervene if smart experts with good data determine it's beneficial. Who decides what data is reliable? Who determines which benefits and costs to measure? Who defines net positive? Suddenly, you're not defending markets on principle. You're arguing about empirical studies, which can be contested, manipulated, reinterpreted. You've moved the debate from should government intervene in voluntary exchanges to does this particular intervention produce favorable statistical outcomes? Mises called this the interventionist wedge. Once you accept that intervention can be scientifically justified through empirical analysis, you've opened the door to unlimited intervention, limited only by what studies claim to demonstrate. Let me give you a concrete example that's crucial today: monetary policy during recessions. Chicago School position generally. Empirical analysis of the Great Depression shows the Fed contracted money supply, worsening the downturn. Therefore, during recessions, the Fed should expand money supply to prevent deflation and stimulate recovery. Data supports countercyclical monetary policy. Austrian School position. Economic logic proves you cannot cure a recession caused by monetary distortion with more monetary distortion. The recession is the economy correcting malinvestments made during the artificial boom. More monetary expansion delays necessary correction and sets up worse crisis later. What empirical studies show as recovery from monetary stimulus is actually prolonging the underlying imbalances. See the difference? Chicago says data shows it works. Austria says logic proves it cannot work sustainably, and what looks like working in data is misidentify recovery with postponed correction, whose right matters enormously. If Chicago is right, the Fed should aggressively expand money during recessions, which is exactly what they did in 2008 and 2020. If Austria is right, those interventions set up worse problems, which is exactly what Austrians predicted and exactly what we're experiencing with the inflation and financial instability following massive monetary expansion. Here comes a crucial insight. Chicago School's methodology provides no principled line against intervention. Each intervention is evaluated pragmatically. If empirical analysis suggests benefit, support it. This is why many Chicago-trained economists supported 2008 bailouts, supported quantitative easing, supported COVID monetary expansion. The data, they claimed, showed these prevented worse outcomes. Austrian economists categorically oppose these interventions not because of different empirical data, but because economic logic proves government intervention in monetary markets necessarily distorts economic calculation and sets up future crises. Notice how this works in reality. Chicago School economists staff the Federal Reserve, advise presidents, design policies, because their methodology says scientific experts analyzing data can optimize intervention. Austrian School economists remain outsiders, warning that the entire framework is flawed, because their methodology says no one can centrally plan optimal outcomes. Mises would say, Chicago School's empiricism, despite opposing many interventions, ultimately provides intellectual legitimacy for the very interventionist state they claim to oppose. By accepting that intervention can be scientifically justified, they've surrendered the principled defense of markets. And that surrender? It's why free market economists ended up supporting bailouts, monetary manipulation, and interventions that Mises would have considered obvious violations of economic law. Methodology determines conclusions. Always. So here's the question you're probably asking. Which approach is correct? I can't make that decision for you, but I can show you what's at stake in choosing. If Chicago School is right, if economics is empirical science where truth is determined by predictive accuracy tested against data, then economic knowledge is always provisional, always subject to revision when new data emerges. Economic laws are really just statistical generalizations that hold usually or on average, but might not apply in particular cases. This means you can never be certain about economic principles. Maybe minimum wage does cause unemployment in most cases, but our new study shows in this particular city it didn't. So the law needs qualification. Maybe inflation is usually caused by money supply growth, but maybe this time it's corporate greed or supply shocks. Maybe, says law, supply creates its own demand, is refuted by Keynesian data. Maybe savings aren't always good. Sometimes consumption stimulates recovery. Everything is contingent. Everything is, it depends. Everything requires empirical analysis of the specific case. If Austrian School is right, if economics is logical science where truth is determined by deduction from undeniable axioms about human action, then economic knowledge is certain, universal, and not subject to empirical refutation. Economic laws apply always and everywhere because their logical necessities derive from what action itself means. This means you could be certain about economic principles. Minimum wage laws must create unemployment because you cannot logically employ someone whose productivity is worth less than the minimum wage. That's not an empirical hypothesis, it's a logical necessity. Inflation must be caused by increasing money supply because that's what inflation definitionally means. Decrease in money's purchasing power, which can only occur through supply increase. Say's law must hold because production creates income which constitutes demand. Again, logical necessity. Everything is certain. Everything is universal. Everything requires logical analysis of the action category involved. You know what's crucial here? These aren't just different styles. They lead to completely different relationships to economic expertise. Under Chicago approach, you need experts to analyze data, run regressions, build models, test hypotheses. Economic truth is discovered through sophisticated empirical research. You cannot know economic truth yourself. You must trust credentialed economists with their statistical studies. Under Austrian approach, you can know economic truth yourself through logical thinking. You don't need a PhD in regression analysis to understand that price controls cause shortages. You need to think clearly about what exchange is, what prices do, and what happens when you prohibit exchanges below a certain price. Economic truth is accessible to anyone willing to think logically. Imagine this scene. You're trying to understand whether inflation is caused by money printing or corporate greed. Chicago economist says, "Let me show you my regression analysis, controlling for money supply, velocity, output gap, supply shocks, and market concentration. The data suggests." Austrian economist says, "Think it through logically. If prices rise across all sectors simultaneously, can that be caused by thousands of unrelated businesses independently deciding to be greedier? Or must it be caused by the common factor affecting all prices? Decrease in money's value from supply increase?" Logic gives you the answer without needing statistical analysis. Which approach empowers you? Mises believed, and I find this compelling, that Chicago School's empiricism, despite its scientific appearance, actually disempowers ordinary people by making economic truth depend on expert data analysis. It creates a priesthood of credentialed economists whose statistical studies you must accept on authority. Austrian praxeology, despite seeming more abstract, actually democratizes economic understanding by showing anyone can grasp economic truth through logical thinking about their own experience of action, choice, and exchange. Here's what you need to understand. Both schools oppose socialism. Both defended markets. Both produce brilliant insights. But Chicago School's methodology ultimately accommodates intervention if data supports it, while Austrian School's methodology categorically rejects intervention as logically unable to improve on voluntary exchange. That difference? It determines whether you have a principled defense of freedom or pragmatic case-by-case empiricism that bends to whatever the latest studies claim to show. And in America today, as government expands, as the Fed manipulates money, as interventions multiply, that methodological difference matters more than ever. Now you see the Austrian versus Chicago divide in completely different light. This is an academic inside baseball. This isn't minor, methodological quibbling. This is a fundamental question. How do you know what you know about economics? And that question determines everything. When Chicago economists say data shows, they're revealing their epistemology. Economic truth comes from empirical observation and statistical analysis. When Austrian economists say logic proves, they're revealing their epistemology. Economic truth comes from deductive reasoning from undeniable axioms about human action. Mises spent his career insisting this methodological difference matters supremely because methodology determines conclusions. It's not that Chicago School economists were stupid or malicious. Many were brilliant and genuinely opposed to socialism. It's that their empirical methodology, despite their intentions, could not provide the certain principled defense of markets that freedom requires. Think about what we discovered together. Same opposition to socialism, different methodological foundations. Same criticism of Keynesianism, different reasoning. Same concern about inflation, different solutions. Same appreciation for markets, different understanding of why intervention fails. The Chicago School gave us valuable insights, powerful critiques of price controls, devastating analysis of regulation costs, important empirical documentation of government failure. Friedman's public advocacy converted millions to appreciating markets. But the Austrian School gave us something Chicago couldn't: logical certainty. Universal principles. Principled defense of freedom not dependent on empirical studies that can be contested, manipulated, or reinterpreted. Mises understood what was at stake. In an age when intellectuals demanded scientific, economics meaning empirical, statistical, mathematical, he insisted that true science of human action must be logical, deductive, praxeological. He knew this made him unfashionable in academia. He knew this cost him professional recognition. He accepted that price because he understood surrender methodology, surrender truth. The battle between Austrian and Chicago School isn't over. It rages in every inflation debate, every Fed policy discussion, every argument about intervention. When you hear economists arguing whether data shows a policy works, you're hearing Chicago epistemology. When you hear economists arguing whether a policy logically can work, you're hearing Austrian epistemology. You'll never confuse them again. More importantly, you now understand why the confusion matters. Methodology isn't abstract philosophy. It's the foundation determining whether you can know economic truth with certainty or must always defer to empirical experts claiming statistical authority. Mises chose certainty. He chose logic. He chose praxeology. And that choice is why his economics still stands unrefuted while empirical studies from the 1970s gather dust. From now on, when you encounter economic claims, in news and policy debates, in expert testimony, ask yourself, is this an empirical claim subject to statistical testing or a logical claim derived from the nature of action? Example, studies show the stimulus package created 3 million jobs. That's an empirical Chicago-style claim. Ask, how did they measure created? How did they control for what would have happened without stimulus? How do they know the jobs weren't merely shifted from what the private sector would have created? The statistical analysis cannot prove causation. At best, it shows correlation requiring theoretical interpretation. Compare. Government cannot create sustainable jobs through deficit spending because it must extract resources from the private sector through taxes or borrowing, meaning each government job either destroys a private job or shifts consumption from future to present through debt. That's a logical Austrian-style claim. You can evaluate it yourself by thinking through what deficit spending means, where government gets resources, and what happens to the private sector when resources are redirected. You don't need a PhD to grasp the logic. You need clear thinking. In the coming months, as you hear Fed policy debates, inflation explanations, recession predictions, notice which economists argue from data and which argue from logic. Notice that Chicago-trained economists, staff in the Fed use empirical models to justify intervention. Notice that Austrian-influenced economists use logical analysis to explain why intervention cannot work. The pattern will become crystal clear, and you'll recognize that your choice between these methodologies isn't academic. It's practical. It determines whether you trust expert statistical claims or trust your own logical reasoning about economic principles. Mises trusted logic. He trusted you could understand economic truth without needing an empirical priesthood. That trust empowers you to think clearly about the economic chaos surrounding you right now. There's a phrase from Mises I can't forget. Economics must not be relegated to classrooms and statistical offices and must not be left to esoteric circles. It is a philosophy of human life and action and concerns everybody and everything. It is the pith of civilization and of man's human existence. Do you feel the weight of that truth? Economics isn't for credentialed experts with regression models. It's for you, because you act, choose, exchange, economize every day of your life. The Austrian School, especially as systematized by Mises, gives you the tools to understand economic truth yourself through logical thinking. The Chicago School, despite its brilliance, makes you dependent on empirical experts analyzing data. Which approach serves human freedom? Which approach empowers you? Imagine your life 6 months after truly grasping this distinction. You won't be fooled when economists cite studies claiming intervention works. You'll ask, what does economic logic say? Can the proposed intervention logically accomplish its stated goal, or does it necessarily produce unintended consequences? You'll see through empirical claims to theoretical assumptions underneath. You'll recognize when someone is arguing from principle versus arguing from pragmatic data analysis. This channel exists to discover together the profound insights of Mises and the Austrian School. Thinkers who trusted that ordinary people can understand economic truth when it's explained logically, clearly, systematically. Subscribe if you want to continue this journey of economic understanding that frees you from dependence on expert opinion. In the next video, we'll discover how Mises' method applies to understanding cryptocurrency, why Mises would understand Bitcoin better than most economists. See you there. And meanwhile, may you think clearly, act purposefully, and recognize truth when logic reveals it.